This may come as a shock to some of you, but magic is important in the Total War Warhammer series. It's a hot take, I know, but it's true, and it's poised to be an even bigger deal in the capstone game of this trilogy. A storm is coming. As the realms of chaos yawn wide, the winds of magic will be blowing harder than ever before. There's been a general update to the way power reserves work, how armies are affected by the ether on the campaign map, and a completely new battle rule set for when you take the war to the Dark God's front doorstep. The main takeaway here, before we get to the really colorful stuff, is that an army's winds of magic pool will much better reflect where they are on the campaign map and will increase or decrease substantially depending on whether the region is calm or tempestuous. The idea here is to ensure that you think more carefully about where your troops march on crusade, and that you actively engage with army stances like channeling that you may not have used much in the past. For one, unlike in Warhammer 1 and Warhammer 2, where the base power reserves before Arcane Conduit or additional skills come into play was 60, you can now get it all the way up to 100, meaning you potentially have a lot more winds of magic to work with in regions with strong or tempestuous winds, which can mean an extra Wind of Death or Purple Sun of Xerius, which can mean dozens or hundreds of your opponents killed with the click of a button. So depending on where you move your armies and choose to engage your enemies, your power reserve will steadily begin to rise or fall the more time you spend in that area. If you hang out in a region for multiple turns without an arcane fulcrum to anchor those winds, that power reserve will continue to fall, and your casting potential will be hampered as a result, which for demons is a particularly important mechanic because they're only tethered to the material plane due to the existence of magic. So if you let your power reserve fall low enough by marching through an area with calm winds for many turns, your replenishment rate, your leadership, and physical resistance will all take a dramatic hit. On the flip side, though, near the places where these winds always blow strong, like on the doorsteps of the Realms of Chaos, each Dark Brother has their own unique set of buffs that will kick in once their power reserve is high enough. For Khorne the Blood God, the only Dark Brother that abhors mages and sorcery, it's all about spell resistance, which will become extremely potent as a defensive tool in areas with high winds. For Tzeentch, who has by far the most ways to manipulate these winds on the campaign map, the recharge rate of your barrier passive on all units in your armies will increase substantially, meaning you need to spend less time out of combat before you can plunge back into the fray and begin the murder anew with a refreshed shield. Naturally, the more uptime you have on your defensive shields, the more you'll get out of those hit-and-run units like Screamers and Burning Chariots. For Nurgle the Plague God, you'll get an increase to melee defense army-wide, and for Slaanesh, it's all about speed, baby. Pink and purple go faster. So essentially, whichever elements characterize a demonic faction best, those are the traits that will be emphasized more when your power reserve is managed well. The functional reason for this change is so that magical and non-magical armies have a bit more to think about in terms of campaigning and positioning, and if they're making good use of stances and planning out their approach, their sorcerers will potentially kick even more ass than what we're used to. If you're the Dawi, you can abuse this in much the same way, if only to drain the area of magic with your Rune Lords and ensure that demonic invasions are taking debuffs and attrition before battle is ever joined. It's not a super flashy or over-the-top mechanic, but certainly adds a bit more depth, complexity, and nuance to the way you approach the campaign map, which is a good thing. But there is a crazy addition coming to Warhammer 3's spellcasting system, and sure enough, it's called a Storm of Magic. For one, we seem to finally have confirmation that the Chaos Realms will exist outside of quest battles in at least some capacity, although whether or not they will actually be a part of the campaign map still seems to be up in the air, and I quote, "Storm of Magic is a new battle rule set for Warhammer 3, one that is always active in the non-Khorne Chaos Realms, and if you fight a battle there, other than a survival or quest battle, it will use those settings." It's a bit cryptic, but perhaps another step towards the idea that the playgrounds of the Dark Gods are a physical place that armies can actually interact with in the campaign for Warhammer 3. I guess we'll find out soon enough. You may have noticed back during the Kislev vs. Khorne quest battle reveal that Ice Queen Katerin had a 50 Winds of Magic pool base and infinite reserves, which meant limitless spells. At the time, I had figured that was just so newer players and journalists could get a feel for the spellcasting and blow away endless tides of enemies without having to worry about managing anything, but while that's certainly factored into the equation, it appears that's an actual game mechanic, because in a Storm of Magic, you will always have infinite reserves. Power recharge rate, as in how fast your casting pool fills from the reserve, will still be a mitigating factor, but you will never run out of winds to cast spells with when inside the realms of chaos. These whirling tempests of arcane sorcery will change throughout the course of a battle when this rule set is enabled, meaning that at any given time, a different lord will come to center stage and supercharge your spellcasting and your armies, giving you access to unique Cataclysm spells. These are exactly what they sound like, game-changing abilities that can devastate the opposition and may only be used once per battle. Simply put, they are not very fair. Here's a list of all the effects each of the 8 winds of magic receive when their lore is ascendant, and you'll notice you don't just get access to the Cataclysm spell associated with that wind, you will also get an army-wide buff from it as well. I'm not going to read them all out. They're on the screen right now. If you want to pause it to take a look, feel free. But these remind me a lot of the endgame abilities when you fight the Final Vortex quest battle or the end of the Vampire Coast campaign. There's some extremely powerful stuff here, like Perfect Vigor and army-wide regen auras for Lore of Life, which will be especially potent with more monstrous-focused armies, and Magma Storm, Thunderstorm, and Gehenna's Golden Globe, which are wave clear abilities that have the potential to one-shot enemy blobs. Think of the top-tier damage spells for any Lore of Magic, and then double or triple that level of carnage. You killed entire armies with Wind of Death before, you're going to be able to do even more than that with something like Gehenna's Golden Globe. That is the type of stuff we're dealing with here. But you can only use a Cataclysm spell once per battle, so depending on how you built your army, you'll want to time things so that you can unleash it once the Storm of Magic transfers to the lore and Cataclysm spell you want. It will be rotating throughout those lores constantly throughout the battle, and from the sounds of it, you can pretty easily miss the window on a cast, so you gotta stay on your toes and make sure you time it well. Now you might be asking yourself, what about Khorne? He doesn't cast any spells, and spell resist is kinda boring, even sometimes useless depending on which enemy army you're fighting, because Norgol with the Lore of Death and Slaanesh with the Lore of Shadows, those are not lores that frequently devastate your armies when you're fighting against AI. Warp Lightning will, Searing Doom will, Zinj Fire probably will, but the AI has a kind of bad track record with a lot of other lores. They can't really use damage spells effectively. So what does Khorne get here? Well, this is one of the principal ways he can summon demons, and in fact, when the winds are really blowing during storms of magic, he can call upon his greater demons, the Bloodthirsters, to rampage amongst his enemies. Seems like a pretty fair trade-off to me. Zinj, on the other hand, is unique in that his factions get to pick what the first lore in Ascendancy will be, meaning they can better tailor their strategy to a level that no other race in the game can. And his forces naturally have a ton of abilities that increase the rate at which their power recharges from reserve, making an infinite reserve very strong. So pretty interesting stuff here, I think. It's not a clear and total rework of the existing system, but if it ain't broke, don't fix it, right? And I think Storm of Magic does a good job of demonstrating the wild nature of the Realms of Chaos as it pertains to the winds and how they can supercharge your battlefield tactics. With that said, I'm not seeing any reference to the swath of potential negative side effects for Order factions fighting within the Realms of Chaos, and I think that might be a point of emphasis that should be pushed at some point. An RNG system that could turn your mages into Chaos Spawn or utterly explode them outright on a miscast would simply not be very fun, so I get why they're not emphasizing that element, but it does feel like there should be some drastic potential negatives, at least for low-level mages, casting cataclysmic spells within the Dark God's own playground. I hope there's some counterplay to these top-level spells as well, because I can't say I relish the idea of point-and-click abilities that just one-shot enemy armies without time to dodge or respond appropriately. I know a lot of people love seeing those cinematic elements, and obviously the visual elements of those spells is fantastic, but it's a strategy game. Strategy is important. Tactics are important. Counterplay is important, even in campaign, and the AI should be able to respond to them so that you don't just instantly get army evaporating abilities off every single time you cast one. Some of the detractors of the Warhammer series believe Total War's kind of devolved into a point-and-click fest without much tactics or strategy, and while I certainly don't agree with that line of logic at all, abusing spells like Wind of Death against the AI, which, like I said, is awesome on the visual side, is obviously not the pinnacle of real-time strategy. And some of these Cataclysm spells will be even more devastating than what you'd see from an overcast purple sun on a huge blob or a Wind of Death down the line of an enemy army. So it'd be good to see some additional downsides and counterplay thrown in here as well. Let me know what you all think of the new system, and I will see you all in the next video. Indie Pride, signing out for now. Have a good one, guys.